So, Professor, I would like to welcome you to the show.
I'd like to welcome you to Sydney.
Thank you so much. If anyone watching would remember Professor from the third episode that we recorded on the podcast, I'll drop the link in the description below. So, I've had the pleasure to visit Sydney, and also I've had a personal tour from Professor before we are recording this. We are also recording this at the place we had lunch, which is Vacanza Pizzeria. So, if you follow Professor on Insta or Twitter, you would know that it's his favorite pizza place in Sydney.
Oh, not my favorite, my only pizzeria.
Oh,
this is where you come from pizza for pizza in Sydney, Vacanza, Surrey Hills.
perfect. So if anyone is in Sydney, this is in Surrey Hills. It's Vacanza Pizzeria. I'll also drop the link to this place,
Fantastic.
and you can just check it out. One question I also had for you is because you have done extensive research on the Chinese economy as well, and I think that in India we have a lot of misconceptions about the Chinese political system and the rise of China from the 1980s. I think there's a sort of jealous
I've heard a lot of it. Yes.
yeah, there's a sort of jealous sentiment also within us Indians. Like the Pakistanis are jealous of Indians for making some economic progress. We are jealous of the Chinese because we were in the same boat, let's say in the 1960s,
Yeah.
economically speaking. So, but just talking outside, you have been a bit critical of the Chinese economic policies,
Right.
and you had a very interesting take about it. So, if you could just explain to us how you view the Chinese economy and the rise of the Chinese economy.
It should already be clear that I'm a comparativist. I'm a comparative social scientist. When trying to look at the reasons for India's democratic success, how do I know the reasons in India? I have to look for how India differs from other countries and how it's similar to other countries. In the same way, when we look at economic development, we don't have any absolute answer. There are lots of theories of economic development. We have to look to comparative data and try to understand how the different trajectories of different countries have been similar or different. So China and India are both post-socialist transition economies. Socialism was never as extreme in India as it was in China, and thus, if we go back to 1980, India, by most accounts, would have had a higher level of GDP per capita
Yes.
than China in 1980. Not a lot higher, but in percentage terms, quite a bit higher. But we can compare the experience of China and India to the experience of the Soviet Union, and its collapse, so its very rapid transition to capitalism, compared to the experience of East Central Europe, which had a transition from capitalism to socialism, forced on it after 1945. Post-socialist transitions or transitions to and from socialism. What we say is that a socialist economy, its success is determined by how well the planners are able to plan the economy. The Chinese planners were absolutely terrible. Mao Zedong was the worst economic planner you could imagine, and thus China had the lowest per capita economic statistics imaginable by 1980. By the time Mao died in the late 70s, and the transition by 1980. On the other hand, Soviet planners were reasonably successful. Now, they were never anything like as successful as capitalist economies in the United States, but they were reasonably good at allocating resources in the economy. Not great, but as good as they could allocate resources as well as, say, Brazil could allocate resources or Mexico could allocate resources. They were in that league. Now, India also had a very low quality of socialism and very poor central planning in India. And so by 1980, India and China were both very poor relative to the rest of the world. China liberalized around 1981. We could say 1980 to 1982 in that era. India liberalized about 10 years later in 91. For both countries, liberalization meant taking the lid off the economy. That is, both China and India had societies that were similar in character to relatively more productive countries. So both of them had relatively educated elite, a large number of commercial families. Both of them were globally integrated into global markets before state planning prevented all that. Okay. India had Tata's Air India before it nationalized it, right? It didn't have to build. It wasn't like a country in Africa that created a state-owned airline at a very low productivity. It had a commercial airline that it then nationalized. When India removes that lid and privatizes it, of course, Air India is going to grow. Now, that same story was repeated across the entire economy after 1991. Both China and India were in potential much more productive places. In India, the Nehruvian central planning had limited India's productivity, and in China, Maoist central planning limited China's productivity. China lifted the lid. It started to grow very rapidly after 1981. India lifted the lid, started to grow very rapidly after 1991. China's liberalization was more widespread and quick than India's. And so instead of being 10 years behind China, India is now 14 years behind China in its growth trajectory. But the trajectory is the same. It's not quite as rapid growth in India, but it's the same trajectory. Now, China's trajectory is leveled off because China, although it stopped destroying its economy, there's no Xi Jinping is not sending Chinese peasants to yell at the birds in the trees to stop them from eating the crops, right? I mean, China has now become a modern country with a modern economy. But it is afraid of continued liberalization. It's afraid of the success of its citizens. When Jack Ma became too successful and criticized the government, they quashed his IPO. They took control of Alibaba and Alipay away from him. Yeah. China will not allow its entrepreneurs to become alternative centers of power to the Communist Party.
Yep.
And because they won't allow pluralism, they won't allow its entrepreneurs to compete with the government, China's not going to grow any further. It's reached as far as it can go without challenging the dominance of the Communist Party. India, of course, has not reached that point yet. India can still grow without doing anything. And I use the example to people. India currently has a GDP per capita around 2,500 US dollars per year. That's almost exactly the same as the continent of Africa.
Yep.
India has a similar population to the continent of Africa. But look at India. India has a network of 24 IITs. India has a national rail network. India has 24-hour electricity. India has universal sanitation. India has already started cleaning up its rivers, is improving its environment. It's very bad now, but it's working to improve it. India has a digital economy, a nationwide digital payment system, unified tax structure. So why is India as poor as Africa? Well, my answer is it won't be as poor as Africa for very long. Right? It's as poor as Africa because its legacy of bad governance, not because of its current bad governance. So that's why India is growing rapidly. India is growing rapidly because it's rapidly growing towards where it should be at equilibrium.
Got it.
Which is probably around $10,000 to $12,000 GDP per capita. India's equilibrium level of output is probably similar to China's equilibrium level of output for now. Now, if we get to 2035, 2040, and India has inched past China in GDP per capita, will India continue to grow? It's hard to say. I think India's potential is much greater because it is a pluralist system. There's federalism, there's strong power both the center and in the states. Of course, there's no dictatorial party to prevent alternate bases of power. Because it's an open political system, the political system welcomes successful companies and entrepreneurs as opposed to China seeking to control successful entrepreneurs. I suspect India will continue to grow where China has stagnated, but that's a prognostication for for 10 to 15 years in the future. For the next 10 or 15 years, India's growth is baked in.
But you're saying that good policy decisions made now and in the near decade will decide if India is trapped in this middle income.
Well, right now, India doesn't need good policies. India can continue to grow with bad policies. Now, I know that may sound strange, but every Western investor I talk to says, oh, it's terrible to invest in India. You can't get land. It's too complicated. There's too much regulation. You have to deal with too many layers of government. There are, problems with protests. There, all these problems they face. Yeah, but India's growing 7% a year, right? Despite all these problems, India's still growing 7% a year. So clearly, India doesn't need the good policies to grow at 7% a year. Why? Well, India has strong universities. India has a national transportation network. India has electricity. India has all these ingredients that similar GDP areas, sub-Saharan Africa, right? These areas of the world don't have all these advantages. That's why they're stable at 2,500 GDP. India is not in equilibrium
Mhm.
at 20. India is in massive disequilibrium with a bias towards growth. Now, India will need those good policies. It needs agricultural reform. It needs a liberalization of the transport sector. It needs a lot of it needs a lot of improved policies. It needs a good education policy, not just a good enough education policy, but it
Mhm.
has to be educating people better. It has to do all the things that a developed country does if it wants to change its equilibrium output, which I would guess is right now $10,000 or $15,000 a year. The equilibrium output for not the current output of India, the equilibrium output that we're moving towards. If it wants to change that to $50,000 a year, it'll have to have policies that resemble a European country,
Okay.
not policies that India currently has.
Correct. Also, since we mentioned Mao Zedong, talk to me about Deng Xiaoping.
Yeah.
He's considered to be an economic guru, the person who liberalized. Somewhere people draw a parallel between Deng Xiaoping and Lee Kuan Yew
Yeah.
in terms of a person who led to an economic boom in their own countries. So when we're talking about lifting this
Yeah. Lifting the lid.
lid, do you think that Deng Xiaoping had a role to play in this, or do you think that
He had a role
it
to
was
play lifting the
inevitable?
lid. No, it's not inevitable that China would grow. China could have remained a absolute communist dictatorship over the economy with a state-owned economy if someone else had won the leadership tussle in the early 1980s. What Deng Xiaoping did was stop destroying the Chinese economy.
Okay.
He did virtually nothing good. He stopped doing things that were terrible. And that's easy. That's the easiest form of growth is just don't do terrible things. Okay, when you stop destroying the economy, it grows. If you have the advantage China has. If you did the same thing right now in Central Africa, if you went to Congo, Zaire,
Hmm.
and just deregulated the economy, no, it would not grow. Why? Because Zaire has extremely low literacy. It has no transportation network.
Hmm.
It has no governance. There's no security. The country has multiple internal insurgencies that are Zaire does not Congo does not have the characteristics of a middle income country.
Okay.
China had those characteristics. It had a working university system under the communists. It had a nationwide government bureaucracy. It had a nationwide administrative system, taxation system. It had ports that were functional. Uh, it simply wasn't allowing, and it had entrepreneurial families who knew how to do business,
Okay.
who had all been repressed after 1949. But 1949 to 1981, I mean, that's only 30 years, right? I mean,
Yep.
those families were still the children, were even the business families were still there. In fact, we know from sociological research that most of the families that became rich in China in the 1980s and 90s
Okay.
were the same families that had been rich in China in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Right? The family continuity is right there through China's business development. So China had all these advantages, but the Communist Party was preventing all of that from coalescing into a productive economy by ordering people, don't grow crops that will succeed, you will grow wheat.
Yep.
Don't make steel here where there's iron and coal and transportation. Make steel here because that's where communist planning says it's safer from invasion. Right? So they were destroying their own economy. Deng Xiaoping removed a lot of that state control on the economy. However, China has not learned how to move beyond the middle income status. The Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping is still seeking, it prioritizes its own dominance over society,
Hmm.
is more important to the Chinese Communist Party than economic growth.
And so in this dance between the dragon and the elephant, so to say, how much importance do you give democracy and the communistic, the one party? So the politics of the countries, how do you put that into perspective? Is it very important?
I don't think democracy matters right now. I mean, for growth, democracy matters
Yeah.
in a moral sense, but
Yeah.
not for economic growth. India would be growing right now, no matter who was running it. And I point out to Indians who believe in Narendra Modi's incredible economic management that India was growing faster under Congress, in the early part of the 21st century.
Yeah.
Uh, Not because Congress managed better, but because India was even poorer. So when you start growing, the gains are really easy.
Yep.
And then as you continue to grow, the gains get harder and harder and harder. No matter who governed India,
Mhm.
India will be growing,
Mhm.
but that growth will get harder and harder over the next 10 or 15 years until by 2035 or 2040, India will need massive reform in order to keep growing. And that's very difficult. It gets more and more difficult the richer you get to continue to grow. Just look at a country like Australia. Australia is, only, I haven't done the numbers recently, but it's only about 80% as wealthy as the United States, and it's not catching up because growing that extra bit is extremely difficult.
Mhm.
Now, for India, that's not a problem. It's not going to reach that for a long time. However, democracy in India is likely to become extremely important in 10 or 15 years when India reaches middle income status.
Okay. So you're saying that China is facing not having democracy right now.
I wrote in 2011 in Foreign Affairs magazine that China's growth would stall in 2020.
Okay.
Arvind Subramanian, later chief economic advisor of India, had an article next to mine saying that China would overtake Europe in GDP per capita by 2035 and overtake America in GDP per
Okay.
capita
Yeah.
by 2045. Now, I think I won that debate. I don't think China's going to overtake America. And the reason is that China has been limited by the political need of its political establishment to maintain its own position as being more important than the country growing. It's more important to Chinese leaders that they not be booted out of office by some entrepreneur. In the same way in Russia, when Russia had to transition to capitalism, Russia started, I mean, there was initially a big shock, and Russia grew very rapidly. But for Vladimir Putin, in around 2010, it started to become more important for him to maintain his position than to allow China to grow, to allow Russia to grow. And so he started reining in the oligarchs, which means essentially reining in private business in order to ensure his control over Russia.
But then how do you explain countries like Singapore or Dubai who have escaped the middle income
Yeah.
economy
Virtually-
not being a democracy?
Virtually no country has escaped the middle income trap on its own. Virtually. There is one country that has, Japan.
Okay.
Japan escaped the middle income trap under US occupation because the United States occupation forces denied privileges to the existing elite. Because in the 1950s and 60s, the United States was staunchly against the old pre-war Japanese elite. And the pre-war Japanese elite did not voluntarily give up power and let people rise up and become rich.
Mm-hmm.
They were forced out by the US occupation administration. If you want to credit somebody for Japanese growth, not enough people give this credit. Credit General MacArthur because he took all of these oligarchs and militarists who controlled Japan and simply retired them. He didn't assassinate them or hang them,
Mhm.
but he turfed them out. He said, "This is not your country anymore. It's going to be a new country."
Okay.
Other than that, the other examples we have of growth beyond middle income status are all in one way or another special cases. So, for example, the four Asian tigers. If we look at Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong,
Yes.
Singapore and Hong Kong are cities. They're not countries. Now, yes, legally they're countries. They have a nation state of their own. Well, not Hong Kong. Singapore is a nation state. Hong Kong is a special administrative region. But the region of which Singapore is the economic center includes Malaysia and half of Indonesia. So if I were to take the economic region that is governed from Singapore,
Got it.
that region it's done reasonably well, but it probably has a GDP per capita of $18,000 or $20,000 a person. It's only Singapore that's rich. Now, I can use the illustration if we look at Brazil. Sao Paulo is a rich city. If I were to have Sao Paulo succeed from Brazil, we would be talking about the Sao Paulo miracle economy. But it's not because it's statistically included within Brazil. Moscow, same thing. Moscow's a rich city. Go to Moscow. It's a gorgeous, rich city. Yeah, but it's surrounded by a poor country.
Yeah,
So the Singapore
Sikkim or
test-
Delhi also fits into the same.
yeah, it's just like Delhi. Although Delhi's not nearly as rich as Singapore.
Yeah, but-
Now Singapore has had good policy. Lee Kuan Yew was no Deng Xiaoping. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew was a very good economic manager. He set up very strong institutions for Singapore. I don't want to diminish the Singapore success story. Same thing in Hong Kong. Hong Kong inherited very good institutions from the British. So Singapore and Hong Kong are both advantaged in that way,
Hmm.
but they're not as rich as they seem. They just like if you took the US has a GDP per capita of I haven't looked at it today, 80, $85,000, whatever it is. If you said looked at the New York City metropolitan area, oh, it'd be 100 something.
Yeah.
If you looked at the island of Manhattan, it would have a GDP per capita of $200,000. And it's the same effect as, say, Luxembourg.
Yeah.
Luxembourg's not that rich. Luxembourg's just a tiny city in a region. Okay, look at Hong Kong. I'm sorry, look at Taiwan and Korea. In South Korea, 60% of the population lives in Seoul. Is South Korea a country or is South Korea Seoul plus some farms? Right now, the people in Busan would be furious if I said it's, but statistically,
Hmm.
South Korea is Seoul. Statistically, 40% of Taiwan lives in Taipei. So again, is it a country or is it a city with some countryside attached? To some extent, it's both. But in both cases, it's notable that South Korea and Taiwan are much poorer than Hong Kong and Singapore. Right?
Yes.
Now, Seoul and Taipei are not poorer than Hong Kong and Singapore,
Got it.
but the two countries are poorer
Yeah.
than Hong Kong. So these are special cases. Of course, the Gulf Emirates are all special cases. That's an oil economy. I get sick of, every amateur development economist I talk to tells me that Argentina in 1910 to 1920 was one of the richest countries in the world. I said, no, it's the same as Kuwait. Kuwait's full of oil. Oil prices are high. Kuwait's rich. Argentina produced beef at a time when there was a massive shortage of beef due to World War I. It was very rich because of beef. Beef prices collapsed in the 1930s. Argentina returned to being a normal middle-income country. These are just quirks, statistical quirks.
But would you go as far as saying that these are not necessarily productive economies?
They are productive economies, but if I ask you, where is not the Singapore nation state,
Hmm.
where is the Singapore economy? Well, most of Malaysia is included in the Singapore economy, in that those areas are being directed and financed, and the technology is much of it is coming from Singapore. Not all of it. Malaysians don't get angry with me, but remember, Singapore was part of Malaysia.
Yeah.
Mean, Singapore was kicked out of Malaysia in
Yeah.
1962.
Ironically.
Ironically, if that had never happened, and Lee Kuan Yew said that was the saddest moment of his life. He wanted to be
Yes.
a business person in Malaysia. If Singapore had never been kicked out of Malaysia, nobody would be talking about the Singapore economic miracle.
Okay.
Malaysia would simply have a few $1,000s extra GDP per capita on its tally, right? The Gulf states, these are natural resource economies that simply through the accident of fate have small populations and high levels of oil. Of course, if like Iran, you have a large population and a large amount of oil, you're not rich, right? But if you have a tiny population and a large amount of oil, then you're rich. They're not productive, or I should say, they're only productive to the extent that they rely on foreign labor. So it's not the Emiratis who are productive. It's the Indians working in the Emirates, or it's the Americans working in the Emirates. The Emiratis are not developing their own resources in their own economy.
Yeah, makes sense. And moving on to the country that we are in, Australia.
Yeah.
Australia is not a city country, it's a big country.
Yeah.
It's a rich country as well. Population around 27 million, GDP per capita around $65,000, if I'm not wrong.
Depends how you count exchange rates and purchasing power parity, but
Okay.
in that range, 72,000 on purchasing power parity basis.
Exactly. So when we're talking about the Australian economy and how it also inherited British institutions.
There's a very famous book here called The Lucky Country by an intellectual called Donald Horne, almost 50 years ago, which his claim, and I think he's absolutely correct, is that Australia was lucky to inherit British institutions. And if you take British institutions and put them in a very natural resource rich environment with no space constraints, no foreign wars, you end up with Australia, which is 10 or 15% more productive than the UK, but with a very similar economic structure.
Right. So we were also earlier talking about
very similar institutional structure.
Yeah. So we were earlier talking about the productivity levels in Australia. How immigration naturally helps an economy, but in Australia it has been certainly overdone.
I wrote an article for Foreign Policy magazine 5 years ago called The World's First Immigration Economy. That is, Australia is the world's first country whose economic model today for growth model, depends simply on immigration. You bring more people into the country, the economy will grow.
Okay.
As a result, the last 10 years, Australia's GDP per capita has hardly grown at all. It's been stagnant. However, the economy has grown quite robustly. Why? Because Australia is admitting so many immigrants that population growth of 2 to 3% per year is translating into GDP growth of 2 to 3% per year. The GDP per capita is stagnant.
Yep. Yep.
Or 1%. I mean, it's very low.
Mm-hmm.
But throw on top of that 2 to 3% annual population growth, and the GDP is growing.
So you bring in more people, the GDP grows.
Yeah.
But the GDP per capita is not growing.
So productivity is not growing. More people are behaving at the same old level of productivity.
Correct.
While the rest of the world is becoming more productive. And productivity in general tends to grow about 2% per year. As a general background, global productivity growth, the US economy tends to grow around 2% per year. If Australia's productivity had kept in line with global productivity trends, that is, if it were adopting technologies and adopting ways of doing business at the same rate as the rest of the world is, Australia's economy would be growing at 5% a year. It would be a massive economic success story. But as any economist will tell you, if you have more of something, you inevitably drive down the price or drive down the usage. So if you throw more people into a labor market, well, the average productivity of the people will decline. You'll use more people at lower average productivity.
Yeah. What is the political incentive for, let's say, the Labour Party to not pay attention to this issue?
No, everyone's eyes are closed to this because the universities want the tuition money.
But they only get one semester's money.
Well, for half their students. I mean,
Yeah.
half are staying,
Yeah.
Half are exploiting
Yeah.
the system. That's for the lower tier universities. At the expensive universities, the group
Okay.
of eight, as we call them, Sydney, Melbourne, UNSW, Monash, Queensland, Adelaide, Australia National University, University of Western Australia. Those are the group of eight. They're much higher tuition levels. Students only go there if they actually want the degree. So they're not suffering this problem.
Okay.
They all lobby for high levels of international student admissions. The real estate industry is very aggressively lobbying. So there's been a lot of pressure here, popular pressure, believing that housing and especially apartment prices have been driven up by this huge international student intake. The real estate industry has repeatedly argued that no, it has no effect. Now, ridiculously, because 9% of all rental housing in Australia, nationwide, 9% is occupied by international students in a market that has a vacancy rate of 0.9%. So clearly, this enormous influx of international students is driving up rental rates. But the real estate industry has published study after study claiming that there's no relationship. So the real estate industry wants the international students, the universities want the international students, business in general wants international students because it's both low-wage labor and increases consumption, so increases the sales that they have. The entire business and university communities are staunchly behind this, and government looks the other way.
I'll just sideline into Australia. I would like to bring your attention back to China.
Yeah.
And again, I think there's a lot of misconception about Chinese politics in India. And I know you, in the general sense, you know a lot about Chinese
I've
politics.
done a lot of work on China in the last 10, 15 years.
So if you could just briefly explain to us how the CCP is lined up, how political systems in China are lined up, and what one has to do.
China's a communist party dictatorship.
Okay.
But it's a party dictatorship, not a personal dictatorship. Now,
what's the difference between the two?
Well, the difference is that
in terms of a policy level.
Well, first of all, the difference structurally is that Xi Jinping does not run China. The Communist Party runs China. Xi Jinping tries to control the CCP.
Okay.
Tries. But he can't be everywhere. He can't control everything. He can't wear every hat. He does, he attempts to control it. And party dictatorships, if you look at the old Soviet Union, it was the same way. Stalin was able to run the country as a dictator, but he was incredibly ruthless. He murdered not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, millions of people in order to maintain his rule. It's very difficult to maintain your personal rule. Xi Jinping has not gone to those lengths, right? So it's the Communist Party bureaucracy that runs China. Xi Jinping is not merely a factional leader. He's clearly, over the last 15 years, attempted to cement his position as the leader for life. He got rid of the limits on presidential terms. He said he's essentially set himself up to be president for life, chairman for life.
Yep.
But his power might be compared to that of, say, Deng Xiaoping, who stayed in power even after he officially left
Or Mao
office.
Zedong?
Not as much as Mao Zedong. So he's
Okay.
not. I mean, Mao Zedong was a dictator on the Stalinist
Yep.
line. Mao Zedong ruthlessly eliminated
Yeah.
all competition. So it is a party dictatorship, not a personal dictatorship. Now, that doesn't, well, I guess that probably does matter somewhat for development, in that there are alternative bases of power. There are factions in China. There's at least some competition in the Chinese system, in a way that a pure personal dictatorship like Idi Amin's Uganda, or Franco's Spain, or if you think of a true personal dictator, no, they eliminate all alternative bases of power, and China's not quite like that.
Okay.
But I wouldn't want to live there all the same.
No, but still talking about politics in China, like, are people very even at the local level? Is there a lot of local politics going on? Are people very politically active? If, let's say, Xi Jinping were to die tomorrow,
Yeah.
Is it very difficult to predict a group of successors that he would have?
So first, a small number of people are very politically active. The broad mass of the population has no engagement with politics whatsoever.
Okay.
However, people who are, and even the ordinary Chinese Communist Party member has no involvement in politics whatsoever. I mean,
there's no voting or election of any kind.
No, I mean, there's a nominal election where you have to vote for there's only one candidate. So an election with one candidate, an election, that's not very meaningful. And those are within party elections.
Okay.
But even an ordinary member of the Communist Party, remember, something like 20% of China is members of the Communist Party. Even an ordinary Communist Party member has no say whatsoever. It's people who are in party bureaucratic positions who begin to have some power in the system. And of course, there's no panopticon. The party can't be everywhere. Yes, there's this massive surveillance state in China, but still, the state has to govern through local administrators, has to govern through chiefs in towns, in provinces in China. And inevitably, there are personal friendships, there are alignments, there are factions. And China has those factions. Now, the question becomes, what would happen? And this is a question I've often asked sinologists. What would happen if Xi Jinping died? Sinologists tell me, oh, he's going to be president forever. And I say, for all you know, he's going to drop dead tomorrow of a brain aneurysm. Or even more challenging, what would happen if Xi Jinping became incapacitated in the hospital, but still alive? Well, these things happen. Like, people have aneurysms, people have strokes. These things can happen. Xi Jinping won't live forever. In that case, we'll see a return to politics in China. He has not set up a natural successor.
Okay.
There is no obvious person who would just step into his shoes, and that's a serious weakness of virtually all dictatorial systems. People try sometimes to set up a son or a daughter as a successor, but that's rarely a smooth transition, because the son or the daughter doesn't necessarily command the loyalties that the parent did, typically that the father did. North Korea is one of the few examples we see of father-son transmission of political power, but that's only been 3 generations. In China, Xi Jinping has not set up his child, his daughter, to be a successor. Who would succeed? I'm not enough of a sinologist to know. I don't speak Chinese. I'm not a sinologist. I know how the system works. I don't know the individuals in the system, but certainly there will be a factional battle.
But how is there, okay, maybe we're coming from a democracy, so I just don't know. How are their enforcement? Like, what is the judiciary in China? How do you enforce contracts? Where does the local...
The judiciary are administrators, there's not a combative judicial system as we would see in the US or in India. Instead, There are magistrates, and look, that's not just a matter of China. Even in the French system, there are fact-finding magistrates who make decisions.
Okay.
In the Chinese system, there are judges. There is a facade of a courtroom battle,
Hmm.
but in practice, the judge and the prosecutor are both on the same team, so to speak. The judge is not a neutral, and the judge is just as much a part of the policy apparatus as the prosecutor. That said, contracts can be enforced when the party wants to enforce them. And commercial contracts, as I understand it,
Hmm.
generally are enforced if they don't involve state-owned enterprises. It's very difficult to enforce a contract against a state-owned enterprise because, again, power centers in China are not only provinces and government,
Hmm.
the state-owned enterprises themselves are power centers.
Yep.
The Chinese National Oil Company is a power center. China Telecom is a power center. So they have political power of their own. But in the ordinary course of events, if a supplier for a car manufacturer hasn't paid its bill, yes, they can take to court and have the bill have a judgment to get the bill paid.
No, and talking about the provinces of China. So I was looking at a podcast recently, and they were talking about the local debt bubble as well in
Yeah.
Chinese economy. So the national economy does not seems to have a good GDP to debt ratio. But then you start double clicking on
Yeah,
the
yeah.
provincial. So explain to us why, first of all, the Chinese market is a highly distorted market, and this provincial debt.
So debt, it's difficult to analyze debt in China because it doesn't have the same meaning that it does in a capitalist country.
Okay.
In a capitalist country, debts have to be paid, right? I mean, it's that simple. If you don't
Yeah.
pay, you default.
Yes.
Uh, but in China, debts are much of it is intergovernmental debts or debts from a state-owned enterprise to a government.
Hmm.
Um, do those have to be paid? They can just be left unpaid. And in fact, if you look at rates of debts beyond 120 days, which is usually the cutoff for when a default is,
Hmm.
China has extremely high levels of past due payments that are more than 120 days past due. But that doesn't force the company or the state into
Yeah.
bankruptcy
Yep.
because who's going to force it into bankruptcy? You have to get a judgment. Who's going to do that judgment? Well, the court that is part of the system, so it's all run by the Communist Party. So debt doesn't quite have the same meaning. It's a misallocation, but there's not necessarily a day of reckoning for that misallocation that would occur in a capitalist country. So in a capitalist country, you can only misallocate resources so far until the debt comes due. You can't pay it. And then, yes, there are terrible, like ridiculous cases of misallocation of resources. Companies that got $1 billion venture capital funding and then disappeared. This misallocation does occur in capitalist countries, but it always reaches a limit when the creditors are no longer willing to put more money in. In China, that limit doesn't apply.
But the CCP inherits this debt eventually, right? The day of reckoning has to come for the
A
CCP,
debt
if not
to
for the
whom?
provinces.
I mean, unless it's a debt to a foreign creditor, it never actually has to be paid. I mean, even if it's a debt to a private Chinese firm, um, can a private Chinese firm go and get a judgment against the state government and force it to pay? No. So is it a debt,
It's a
right?
grant.
It's an accounting. It is an accounting mechanism, let's just say.
Hmm.
But because of this, there is massive misallocation in China that continues to be misallocated. I mean, look, let's make this practical. The best example is the Chinese steel industry.
Okay.
For decades, the Chinese steel industry has been producing, I haven't checked the last few years, but as of 3 years ago, it was 100 million tons more steel than China needed. China was producing something like 700 million tons of steel and only needed 600 million tons. And the extra steel was just being produced and put in a pile and it rusts and nothing happens to it. Now, how can that go on for decades? Not for 1 or 2 years. Well, because the state-owned steel enterprise is owned by the provincial government.
Okay.
The provincial government wants to keep people employed.
Okay.
And so it just says, well, keep producing the steel, keep accumulating the debts. That debt ultimately is owed to the state government. When the state government owes a debt to its bondholders, well, the bondholders don't get paid, but who can they go to for redress? The state court? No. So ultimately, no one gets paid. And that's why I said that the key indicator for China, that the economists use, is debt more than 120 days past due. And that debt is not paid. It's a misallocation. It's a misallocation. And that debt is ultimately owed to the state government. When the state government owes a debt to its bondholders, well, the bondholders don't get paid, but who can they go to for redress? The state court? No. So ultimately, no one gets paid. And that's why I said that the key indicator for China, that the economists use, is debt more than 120 days past due. is enormous in China because it never gets written off. It just sits there on the books as debt, and it results in mass misallocation. But it does not result in a collapse or a problem unless there's a foreign creditor involved. And of course, China relies extremely little on foreign debt. There's very low levels of foreign indebtedness. And so the misallocation just continues indefinitely.
No, but as a foreign investor, someone who does not have a skin in the game, you must look at these indicators before investing in
No,
that.
because foreign investors in China do not invest in state-owned enterprises.
Okay.
Foreign investors in China overwhelmingly
Okay.
have foreign direct investment,
Okay.
not portfolio investment. Now,
Got it.
foreign investors in India, it's the opposite. There's a lot of foreign portfolio investment into India. They're investing in the Indian stock market.
Yep.
In China, the stock market has been stagnant for 20 years,
Exactly.
right? There's very little foreign investment in the stock market. Foreigners are investing in their own companies
So
in China.
Tesla or
And so the
Coca-Cola.
foreign, so Tesla is building a factory in China and selling cars and then taking the profits and attempting to repatriate them. That's a whole different issue of how much you can repatriate it. But they're not lending to Chinese firms, right? They're running their own firms, many of them for export, in which case they're making the money not in China, but overseas when they
Overseas.
export. So Apple is not investing in China. Apple is building has built factories in China to sell iPhones to the US. So it's not caught up in this debt cycle that affects the domestic Chinese economy.
No, but you do agree that it's a debt cycle.
I shouldn't have even used the word cycle. I probably should have used the word abyss.
Because black
It's
hole.
a cycle, right? It's not going to go bankrupt. Like everyone's been waiting. Heard people talking about China's impending bankruptcy for a decade now, for 10 years. It's not going to happen. It's simply going to continue to stagnate. Somebody might come along at some point and just do a haircut on it all. It might just say, well, we're going to recapitalize this and all of this debt is going to go into a special purpose vehicle, which will then be.
So eventually the taxpayer pays the debt.
No, nobody will pay it. I mean, yes, in a conceptual sense, the taxpayer will pay the debt.
Yeah.
But the taxpayer won't pay it by paying taxes.
Yeah.
The taxpayer will pay it by suffering low wage growth, right? We'll pay it by suffering economic stagnation.
Yep.
They're never going to realize the debt. They're never going to say, taxpayer, you have to pay an extra $1,000 to pay off our debt, because they're not going to pay off the debt.
Yeah.
Right. Just like no one paid off in the United States, there was a civil war in the 1860s, and the Confederate government issued millions of dollars of war bonds. And after the war, the bonds were just all declared invalid. Nobody paid off the debt. It just evaporated. Right. People never got paid back. But in the China's case,
But it will lead to massive unrest.
no, I don't think so, because who is never going to be paid back in China? The state-owned enterprises or the state, or there's no ultimate creditor who's angry.
Got it.
I mean, the government is the ultimate creditor, or but there's no person who's lent money. Now, even individual Chinese who hold these bonds are still nominally they're at value. They're never being forced to realize the loss. No, the unrest in China is more likely due to stagnation, lack of jobs for educated people. So the typical third world revolution, if you will, occurs because the intellectual class can't find jobs for its kids.
Okay.
I mean, there's overeducated, an overeducated middle class is stuck with nothing to do.
Okay.
And they get upset with the existing political system because they all want jobs in government. Indians will recognize it. This. Everyone wants a job in government. No one can get one. Only in India, with a rapidly growing economy, you can get a job in the private sector. They may not want a job in the private sector, but they can get one. In China, as things stagnate, there will increasingly be a large group of people from
The middle class.
well-off, educated families who have no jobs, nothing to do, and who will be dissatisfied with the current system. And that's where the unrest comes from. The era of peasant rebellions is over. There's not going to be some mass rebellion of the methods of control are too strong.
Yes.
The unrest that happened in 1989 in China was the educated middle class in Beijing and other cities. The
Cinnamon.
Tiananmen Square. But similar things happened in Shanghai and other cities. They just weren't reported on because the global press was in Beijing, right? The
Okay.
global press was not in the other cities.
Okay.
But Tiananmen Square was the emblematic and the most serious
Yes.
massacre. At that point, Deng Xiaoping was willing to kill, no one knows the exact number, 1,000 of the children of the Communist Party elite in order to maintain power.
But he eventually lost it because of it.
No, he didn't lose power. He governed from behind. I mean, he was until he died. He was the power in China. He was willing to kill 1,000 members of the Communist Party's own children, because those were elite children
Yes.
in Beijing, to maintain power. Today, would a Xi Jinping be willing to kill 1,000 students from the children of his own circle's family? I don't think they're as ruthless today. And that's how you have a revolution, is when you're not willing, I hate to put it in these very bloody terms, when you're not willing to kill 1,000 people, there's a revolution. If the army's willing to fire on people, every revolution can be suppressed. And to see that, just look at North Korea.
I'll just circle you back to Iran and Israel, because we're talking at
Sure.
times when they are into a 7-day war, and I would like your opinion on that. So just to clarify, you consider Iran is also a dictatorship, right?
Iran is a theocratic dictatorship. It's a very odd country, and I'm not a specialist on the Middle East or on Iran.
Okay.
But it is certainly not. They have elections. They have more competitive elections than a typical like Communist Party dictatorship. There are some real elections. There are local elections in Iran. And there are some legitimate elections at the parliamentary level. With Iran, the distinctive structure is that ultimately power does not rest with the elected leaders. Power rests with the Ayatollah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So talking about the conflict, war, whatever people may want to call it, it's 7-day now. I'm really impressed by how Israel, the first day, was able to take out a lot of Iranian generals. So the question here basically is that with US into the picture, and now people are saying that Trump has okayed, America getting into the game as well. Well, how do you ensure that this doesn't end up as an Iraq 2001 situation as well, where people go in for WMDs but do not find any?
Well, look, I can't ensure that. There's strong political pressure within Donald Trump's own coalition not to put, as they say, boots on the ground.
Yes.
In Iran.
Yes.
So far, U.S. involvement has been restricted to protecting Israel from Iranian counterattacks.
Okay.
The U.S. has not, in a major way, directly confronted Iran. The U.S. could do so. The big thing that people are debating right now is that the U.S. Air Force has quote unquote bunker busting munitions. That U.S. has strategic bombers, in essence, which Israel does not.
Yes.
And so the U.S. has resources that could be used against Iran. Whether Donald Trump will choose to use those or not, I have no idea. But I think even if he does, whether he does or doesn't, we should view this as a limited war, not as a total war or as a full-scale invasion. There's been no motion towards an invasion of Iran. No, the forces are neither available, nor if they were available, are they in the right places to invade Iran. The idea that Pakistan or Iraq would allow its territory to be used as a jumping off point is a non-starter. Even Iraq is a non-starter for an invasion of Iran. I just think this is a lot of people in the security studies profession wanting to gin up excitement when, look, I don't want to diminish the number of deaths, the terrible suffering that people have gone through in Iran and in Israel. But there's a difference between limited war and all-out war.
By limited, do you mean it will be a short-term war, or do you think it will escalate?
No, I mean bombings and missiles lobbed at each other.
2-3 countries war, not.
Even if we're more countries, it's one thing to bomb strategic sites. It's another thing to invade a country on the ground. And there's not going to be an invasion of Iran by any of its neighbors or by the United States.
Let's say human intuition perspective, if you're talking about if Iran was close to a nuclear bomb, fine, okay, I can understand the proactiveness of Israel. But if it wasn't, wouldn't this just escalate or give Iran more incentive to scale up its nuclear program?
Um, Look, yes and no. I'm not enough of an expert to have a strong opinion on it.
Mhm.
I understand the Israeli perspective that Iran is the one country in the world that credibly threatens to use a nuclear bomb if it gets one. Uh, Even
Yeah.
North Korea has not threatened to use nuclear. I don't, for the record, if you want something controversial, I don't think North Korea actually has nuclear bombs. I think it's all honestly, I think it's all a fake out on North Korea's part. But I understand Israel and specifically Benjamin Netanyahu viewing this as an existential issue for Israel. But I also view it as Benjamin Netanyahu seeing this through a domestic political lens that a war with Iran helps keep him in power.
Yes.
I don't know the right answer to that. I don't know if Iran is close to a bomb or not. I don't know what they would do with one if they got it. I don't know the answers to any of this. All I know is that there's not going to be an invasion of Iran in the foreseeable future. This year, next year, it's not imminent. And a limited war is ultimately limited. I mean, all we have to do is look at the exchange of attacks between India and Pakistan over the Pahalgam massacre.
Yes.
India's retribution for that and Pakistan's response. Yes, people were killed, and I don't want to minimize those tragedies.
Yeah.
But India was never going to invade Pakistan. Pakistan was never going to invade India. The scope of the war is limited by those constraints. And in the same way, no matter how many missiles and bombs the US and Israel might drop on Iran, no matter how many missiles Iran may lob at Israel or at US ships, that's going to remain the character of this war. Iran's not going to invade Israel. Israel's neighbors are not going to invade Israel on Iran's behalf.
Okay.
Israel's not going to invade Iran. The United States is not going to invade Iran. And so that's why the war is limited.
Well, 2025 has been crazy. But on that note, Professor, finally, on a lighter note, I would just like to know, when are you coming back to India?
As soon as
People would like to know.
as soon as I can. Look, I go to India whenever I'm invited by an organization that wants to fly me there.
Yes.
No, I'm serious. I mean, I don't. If I go to India for tourism, with apologies, I would go as a tourist, not to see lots of interviews and people. I mean, if my wife and I go as a tourist, you won't know until we've come back because we
Okay.
want to be tourists and enjoy our family time.
Okay.
So I go to India on business when I'm invited to India. I currently don't have any invitations.
Do you travel? Do they make you travel like economy, or the flights are good?
I'm in the position now, not just regarding India, but in general, that for international events, I generally only go if I fly business class. That's not because I'm too precious to fly economy or so rich. It's just that I have a lot of demands on my time, and it's an easy cutoff because I don't have any extra time. If I want to go to an event in India, that means not writing an article that I would have written if I were here, or
Okay.
it means not. I mean, there's always something else that would have been done. I've reached that stage in life where there's no free time. So demanding business class travel is not because I'm so rich or precious. It's just elevates the level of commitment of the organization. Now, I say that for commercial organizations. For example, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad invited me to the World Hindu Congress in Thailand.
Yep.
I flew economy because it's a civil society organization.
Got it.
But if NDTV, if the Adanis want me to come talk to NDTV, the Adanis have to fly me business class, and that's really the line I draw on it.
Perfect, sir. So on that note, I would like to thank you for coming on the show, and I hope to come back to Sydney and do this again.
I'd love to.
And whenever you are in India, Bombay, Pune, or even in Gujarat, just let me know and we
Certainly
can
will.
hook something up. Yeah.
Certainly will. Great to talk to you.
You too. Thank you, Professor.